Chloe's wide eyes sparkled as she stepped into the grand lobby of the prestigious Lexington Hotel in New York City. The vast space was breathtaking, with its towering ceilings adorned with intricate gold moldings and a massive crystal chandelier that seemed to float in the air like a crown of light. The marble floors gleamed under her tiny sneakers, and the scent of fresh lilies filled the air. It was a place far removed from her quiet suburban home in New Jersey. Clutching her well-worn teddy bear, Mr. Paws, close to her chest, Chloe gazed around with awe. "It's like a castle, Mr. Paws," she whispered, her voice tinged with wonder. "Do you think there's a princess who lives here?" Her parents, Dr. Emily and Dr. Robert Sinclair, exchanged a glance and smiled at their daughter's innocent curiosity. Both were distinguished pediatricians attending a high-profile medical symposium being hosted at the hotel. But for their 7-year-old daughter, this wasn't just a conference. It was an adventure. Emily crouched down to Chloe's level, brushing a strand of her daughter's curly hair out of her face. "Stay right here by the sofa while Daddy and I check in, okay? We'll only be a few minutes." "Yes, Mom," Chloe replied obediently, her voice as soft as the velvet upholstery of the chair she sat on. She swung her legs lightly as she settled in, her teddy bear perched on her lap. The grand lobby bustled with activity. Wealthy guests passed by in designer suits and tailored dresses, their leather luggage wheeled behind them by uniformed bellhops. Chloe watched with wide-eyed curiosity, imagining each person's story. "Maybe that man is a secret agent," she whispered to Mr. Paws, nodding toward a tall man in dark sunglasses. "And that lady could be a movie star." The world around her felt magical. Even the air seemed to hum with an energy Chloe couldn't quite put into words. Despite being surrounded by people, no one seemed to notice the little girl sitting quietly by the sofa. She didn't mind, though. She liked to watch and dream from the sidelines. But not everyone in the lobby was as charmed by her presence. From across the room, Leonard Morgan, the hotel's general manager, surveyed the scene with a critical eye. He was a tall, commanding figure in his late 50s, with neatly combed gray hair and a pinstriped suit that screamed authority. His expression, however, was far from warm. Mr. Morgan's gaze landed on Chloe, her small form a splash of innocence against the sophisticated backdrop of the Lexington. His lips pressed into a tight line as irritation flickered across his face. "What is this?" he muttered to himself. "A child, alone in the lobby? Unacceptable." For Mr. Morgan, the Lexington was more than just a hotel. It was a temple of luxury and perfection. Every detail, from the pristine flower arrangements to the impeccable service, was a reflection of his tireless pursuit of excellence. And in his mind, children, with their sticky fingers and unpredictable energy, had no place in such a refined establishment. With long, deliberate strides, he made his way toward Chloe, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His irritation grew with each step, fueled by the assumptions racing through his mind. "She'll disturb the guests," he thought. "Or worse, damage something expensive." Oblivious to his approach, Chloe chatted softly with Mr. Paws, giggling at their imaginary tea party. Her laughter was delicate, like the tinkling of wind chimes, but to Mr. Morgan it was an unwelcome disruption. "Young lady," Mr. Morgan's voice cut through the air like a knife. Chloe looked up, startled, her big brown eyes meeting his stern gaze. "This is a respectable establishment, not a playground. Where are your parents?" Chloe's small hands gripped Mr. Paws tighter as she tried to process his sharp tone. "They're checking in," she said softly. "I'm just waiting here." "Well, you shouldn't be here alone," Mr. Morgan interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "This lobby is not a place for children to loiter. You'll need to leave immediately." Around them, the once bustling lobby began to grow quiet. Guests and staff alike paused, their attention drawn to the unfolding scene. A middle-aged couple sitting nearby exchanged uneasy glances, and an elderly woman frowned, her disapproval clear. Yet no one stepped forward to intervene. "I'm sorry," Chloe whispered, her lower lip trembling. She stood slowly, clutching her teddy bear protectively. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." You should have thought about that before sitting here unattended, Mr. Morgan snapped, waving her off dismissively. Now go find your parents. As Chloe turned to leave, her small shoulders slumped under the weight of Mr. Morgan's harsh words. The once magical hotel now felt cold and unwelcoming. She walked toward the check-in desk, her head bowed, as the other guests looked on in silence. Chloe reached her parents at the check-in desk, her steps hesitant and her face downcast. Dr. Robert Sinclair noticed immediately, his protective instincts kicking in. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "Everything okay?" Emily, busy sorting out the room arrangements with the receptionist, glanced over her shoulder. "Chloe? What's wrong, honey?" Chloe hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with Mr. Paw's soft ears. "It's nothing," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I was just sitting on the sofa, but a man said I shouldn't be there." Robert's brows furrowed. "A man? Who?" "A worker," Chloe said reluctantly. "He said this isn't a place for kids." Emily turned fully now, her motherly intuition sensing that something was off. "What exactly did he say, Chloe?" Chloe shrugged, trying to act as if it didn't matter. "He just told me to leave, because I was alone. I wasn't being loud or anything." Emily and Robert exchanged a look, their concern evident. Robert straightened and placed a comforting hand on Chloe's shoulder. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said gently. "You didn't do anything wrong. Why don't we head up to the room and settle in? We can talk more there." "Okay, Daddy," Chloe whispered, her grip on Mr. Paw's tightening. As they made their way to the elevators, Emily couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her chest. She wasn't one to overreact, but something about the idea of a staff member chastising her daughter didn't sit right. She glanced back toward the lobby, where the man Chloe described, a tall, gray-haired manager, was barking orders at a bellhop. Her eyes narrowed, but for now she held her tongue. Upstairs in their room, Chloe perked up slightly as she took in the elegant suite. The room was spacious and inviting, with plush bedding, large windows overlooking the city, and even a little sitting area. She immediately gravitated toward the window, marveling at the skyscrapers and yellow taxis below. "This is so high up," she exclaimed, momentarily forgetting the incident in the lobby. "It's like being in the clouds." Emily and Robert exchanged relieved smiles, glad to see her spirits lifting. "Why don't you take Mr. Paws and explore the room while we unpack?" Emily suggested. "Okay, Mommy," Chloe said, already making her way toward the closet to see if it was big enough to play hide-and-seek. While Chloe explored, Emily turned to Robert, her voice low. "We need to say something." Robert sighed, loosening his tie. "About the man downstairs?" "Yes. It's bad enough he spoke to her that way, but what if he's like that to other families? We paid good money to stay here. It's unacceptable." Robert nodded, though he hesitated. "I agree, but let's handle it calmly. We'll go down after we've settled in. No need to let this ruin Chloe's experience." Emily reluctantly agreed, though a quiet anger simmered beneath her calm exterior. No one should make her daughter feel unwelcome, especially in a place that prided itself on luxury and service. Meanwhile, back in the grand ballroom, Mr. Morgan was continuing his rounds, ensuring every detail of the evening's gala was flawless. The tension in the room was palpable. The staff scurried to avoid his wrath as he criticized everything from the lighting to the arrangement of the hors d'oeuvres. "Why is this tablecloth uneven?" he barked at a trembling server. "Fix it immediately. And these flowers, are these wilting? I explicitly requested fresh arrangements." The young server stammered an apology, but Mr. Morgan had already moved on, his sharp eyes scanning for the next imperfection. His pursuit of perfection left no room for understanding or kindness, and the atmosphere grew heavier with every order he barked. Among the staff, whispers circulated. "Did you see how he snapped at that family earlier?" One bellhop murmured to a colleague. "A little girl, no less." "Typical Morgan," the other replied under his breath. "He's been like this for years. Nobody can ever measure up to his standards." Their conversation was interrupted as Mr. Morgan stormed past, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "Back to work!" he barked, and the two quickly dispersed, fearing his ire. Later that evening, Chloe's parents decided to take her for a quiet dinner at the hotel's upscale bistro. As they entered the dining area, the warm glow of candlelight and the hum of soft jazz music created an inviting atmosphere. Chloe's earlier sadness seemed to fade as she marveled at the elegant decor and the beautifully set tables. A kind waiter greeted them with a smile, offering Chloe a special children's menu. "We've got macaroni and cheese with truffle oil," he said, winking at her. "It's fancy, but it's still mac and cheese." Chloe giggled, her confidence returning. "That sounds funny. Can I try it, Mommy?" Emily smiled and nodded, grateful for the waiter's effort to make Chloe feel special. "Of course, sweetheart." As the family settled in and began to enjoy their meal, Mr. Morgan appeared at the entrance to the bistro, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Spotting the Sinclairs, he paused, his expression unreadable. Then, as if deciding they weren't worth his attention, he turned and walked away, his rigid posture reflecting his typical sense of superiority. But he wasn't entirely unnoticed. Emily caught the glance and filed it away, her protective instincts flaring anew. Tonight might be about family, but tomorrow, she resolved, she would make sure this so-called manager learned a thing or two about respect. The following morning, the air in the hotel was buzzing with anticipation for the evening's gala. Staff bustled through the halls, finalizing preparations under Mr. Morgan's watchful and relentless eye. The pressure to meet his impossibly high standards was palpable, leaving everyone on edge. Meanwhile, Chloe's family enjoyed a quiet breakfast in the hotel's sunlit cafe. Chloe was in high spirits, spreading strawberry jam on her toast and chatting animatedly about her plans to explore more of the hotel after her parents' morning seminar. "Maybe I'll find a secret passage," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Just stick to the public areas, sweetie," Robert said with a chuckle. "We don't need you accidentally stumbling into the kitchen or something." Emily smiled but remained preoccupied. She had resolved to speak to Mr. Morgan before the day was out, though she wanted to choose the right moment. Her daughter's happiness mattered more than any gala or hotel policy, and she wasn't about to let the manager's behavior go unchecked. Later that morning, Chloe found herself back in the grand lobby, armed with her trusty Mr. Paws and a heart full of curiosity. Her parents had reminded her to stay out of trouble before heading to their seminar, but Chloe didn't need the reminder. She was always careful to be polite and unobtrusive. As she wandered through the opulent space, she discovered a small art gallery tucked off to one side of the lobby. The walls were lined with vibrant paintings and sculptures, each piece more fascinating than the last. Chloe stopped in front of a large abstract painting, tilting her head as she tried to decipher its swirls of color. "What do you think this is, Mr. Paws?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A rainbow? Or maybe a big, colorful storm?" Unbeknownst to her, Mr. Morgan had emerged from his office and was making his usual rounds. Spotting Chloe once again, he felt his irritation return. "Why is that child wandering around unsupervised again?" he muttered to himself. "Doesn't anyone teach children boundaries anymore?" This time, however, Mr. Morgan wasn't the only one watching. An elderly woman sitting nearby had noticed Chloe and was quietly observing the little girl's fascination with the artwork. The woman's sharp eyes also caught the sour expression on Mr. Morgan's face as he approached. Before he could deliver another scolding, the elderly woman rose from her seat, her steps measured but purposeful. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" Mr. Morgan, momentarily startled, turned to face her. "Madam, this is a high-end establishment," he said, recovering quickly. "We can't have children wandering the premises unsupervised." The woman raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "This unsupervised child, as you call her, is doing nothing more than admiring the artwork. She's quiet, respectful, and harming no one." "Are you really so concerned with maintaining appearances that you've forgotten what hospitality means?" Several nearby guests turned their heads, intrigued by the confrontation. Mr. Morgan straightened his tie, his irritation giving way to defensiveness. "Madam, my job is to ensure the integrity of this establishment." "And what about the integrity of your character?" the woman interrupted, her tone sharp. "I've been staying at this hotel for over a decade, and I've seen how you treat people. It's no wonder the staff and guests alike seem to tread on eggshells around you." Chloe, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, felt a flicker of hope. This woman, with her kind yet commanding presence, seemed to be standing up for her in a way she couldn't have done herself. For the first time, Mr. Morgan found himself at a loss for words. He glanced around, noticing the growing number of onlookers. "I'll take your concerns under advisement," he said stiffly before retreating toward his office. The elderly woman turned to Chloe and smiled warmly. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong, dear," she said gently. "You have just as much right to enjoy this beautiful place as anyone else." "Thank you," Chloe said shyly, hugging Mr. Paws a little tighter. As the day wore on, the incident in the lobby began to spread among the staff, adding to the undercurrent of dissatisfaction with Mr. Morgan's management style. His relentless pursuit of perfection had alienated nearly everyone who worked under him, and the confrontation with the elderly guest had only highlighted his lack of empathy. By the time evening arrived, the hotel was aglow with the anticipation of the gala. Guests in elegant attire filled the ballroom, mingling under the glittering chandeliers as soft classical music played in the background. Despite the festive atmosphere, a sense of unease lingered among the staff. In the center of it all was Mr. Morgan, overseeing every detail with his usual intensity. His sharp eyes darted from table to table, his posture rigid as he scanned for imperfections. But beneath his polished exterior, a seed of doubt had been planted. The words of the elderly woman in the lobby echoed in his mind, challenging him in a way he wasn't used to. Unbeknownst to Mr. Morgan, Chloe and her family had decided to attend the gala as well, their presence a quiet reminder of the human connection that his pursuit of perfection so often overlooked. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of elegance. Tall candelabras adorned with shimmering crystals stood on every table, their flickering flames casting warm golden light across the room. Guests dressed in tuxedos and glittering gowns sipped champagne and exchanged pleasantries. The air buzzed with an energy unique to high society gatherings, a mix of anticipation, pride, and subtle competition. Chloe's eyes were wide with wonder as she walked in beside her parents. Her lavender dress, chosen specifically for the evening, complemented her bouncing curls. She held tightly to her father's hand, her other hand clutching Mr. Paws, who had been given a tiny bow tie for the occasion. Chloe felt like she had stepped into a dream. "Look at the lights, Daddy," she whispered, pointing to the enormous chandelier that dominated the ceiling. "It's like 100 sparkly stars." Robert smiled down at her, his heart full. "It is, sweetheart. Pretty magical, isn't it?" Emily, walking slightly ahead, scanned the room. Her sharp eyes caught sight of Mr. Morgan near the back of the ballroom, deep in conversation with another staff member. His stiff posture and intense expression were unmistakable. Emily felt a renewed resolve to address his earlier behavior, but decided to wait until the timing was right. For now, she wanted Chloe to enjoy the evening. Mr. Morgan's evening, however, was anything but enjoyable. He had spent the entire day dealing with last-minute issues, and while the gala appeared flawless to the guests, he saw every imperfection. A centerpiece slightly off-center. A tray of hors d'oeuvres brought out 5 minutes later than scheduled. A spilled glass of wine that a waiter had been slow to clean up. Each detail grated on his nerves like sandpaper. And then there was the memory of the elderly woman from the lobby. Her words had lingered with him, uncomfortably close to the truth. Had he really lost sight of what mattered? He brushed the thought aside. "Focus," he muttered to himself, straightening his jacket. "There's no room for distractions." As he moved through the crowd, his eyes scanned the room for anything amiss. When his gaze landed on Chloe, he froze. She was standing with her parents near one of the tables, her face alight with joy as she admired the decorations. Despite his growing unease, he couldn't help but notice how out of place she seemed. A small, innocent figure in a room full of polished adults. What is she doing here? He thought, his jaw tightening. This is not a family event. Before he could act, he noticed one of the hotel's most influential patrons, a wealthy philanthropist named Eleanor Whitmore, approaching Chloe's family. Mrs. Whitmore was an elegant woman in her 70s, with a reputation for generosity and a sharp wit. She moved with the grace of someone who knew her presence commanded attention. "Hello there," she said warmly, addressing Chloe directly. "Aren't you just the prettiest young lady?" Chloe's cheeks flushed with shy delight. "Thank you, ma'am," she said, holding Mr. Paws up. "This is Mr. Paws. He's my teddy bear." Mrs. Whitmore chuckled. "Well, it's a pleasure to meet you both." She turned to Emily and Robert, her smile genuine. "And you must be her parents. What a lovely family." Emily introduced herself and Robert, explaining their reason for being at the hotel. Mrs. Whitmore listened with interest, nodding thoughtfully. "It's wonderful to see families here," she said. "Too often these events feel so stiff. A bit of youthful energy is just what we need." Her words struck a chord with the other guests nearby, who nodded in agreement. A man in a tailored suit added, "It's refreshing, really. Reminds us what all this pomp and circumstance is supposed to celebrate. People." Mr. Morgan, watching from a distance, felt a pang of discomfort. The very thing he had viewed as a disruption was now being praised as a positive. For the first time in years, he questioned whether his rigid expectations had blinded him to the human element of his work. As the evening wore on, Chloe's innocent charm continued to win over the crowd. She politely complimented a woman's sparkling necklace, asked a waiter if the hors d'oeuvres were hard to carry, and even helped an elderly guest retrieve her dropped napkin. Her small acts of kindness didn't go unnoticed. By the time dessert was served, Chloe had become something of an honorary guest of honor. She sat between her parents, happily nibbling on a slice of chocolate cake, while the surrounding guests engaged in lively conversations inspired by her cheerful presence. But not everyone was at ease. Mr. Morgan, watching from the sidelines, felt a storm of conflicting emotions. The gala was a success by all outward appearances, yet he couldn't ignore the growing realization that he had been wrong, about Chloe, about families, and perhaps about himself. It wasn't until the end of the evening, as guests began to filter out of the ballroom, that Mr. Morgan finally approached Chloe and her family. He took a deep breath, straightening his tie as he walked over. His expression was carefully composed, but there was a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "Dr. Sinclair," he began, addressing Robert. "May I have a word?" Robert exchanged a glance with Emily, then nodded. "Of course." Mr. Morgan's gaze shifted to Chloe, who was busy adjusting Mr. Paw's bow tie. His voice softened, almost imperceptibly. "I owe you an apology," he said, "both to you and your daughter." Emily raised an eyebrow, surprised but cautious. "An apology?" "Yes," Mr. Morgan said, his tone measured. "My behavior yesterday was unacceptable. I misjudged the situation and acted inappropriately. It's clear now that I was wrong." Chloe looked up at him, her big brown eyes curious but not unkind. "It's okay, sir," she said simply. "Maybe you were just having a bad day." Her innocent words struck Mr. Morgan harder than any scolding could have. He nodded, his throat tightening. "Thank you, young lady. You're very kind." For the first time in years, Leonard Morgan felt something shift within him, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. As he watched Chloe and her family leave the ballroom, he realized that perhaps perfection wasn't about appearances or flawless execution. Perhaps it was about connection, kindness, and the willingness to admit when you were wrong. And for Mr. Morgan, that realization was the first step toward change. Mr. Morgan stumbled through the dimly lit storage area, the musty smell of cardboard and dust filling his nostrils. The polished luxury of the hotel above him was a world away from this cramped, disorganized basement. The faint hum of the building's machinery reverberated around him, and a single flickering fluorescent light cast eerie shadows on the walls. If I fall and break my neck down here, they'd probably just step over me to clock out, he muttered bitterly to himself, his irritation mounting with each passing moment. He hated being in the storage area, surrounded by clutter and chaos. It was a stark contrast to the immaculate standards he upheld in the hotel. His reputation for maintaining order, even at the cost of his staff's well-being, was something he wore as a badge of honor, or had until now. With a grunt, Mr. Morgan reached for the box marked Centerpiece Decorations, perched precariously on a high shelf. His fingers grazed the edge, and he stretched further, his face turning red with exertion. "Come on," he growled, the frustration evident in his voice. Finally, the box teetered forward, wobbling for a precarious moment before it fell into his arms. "Got it," he muttered triumphantly, clutching the box tightly against his chest. The sense of satisfaction was fleeting, though. His back twinged from the strain, and his frustration quickly returned. "At least now it'll be done right," he muttered under his breath as he trudged out of the storage room. His footsteps echoed in the deserted basement hallway, each step accompanied by a growing ache in his chest. As he ascended the stairs and made his way toward the ballroom, his thoughts turned inward. He rehearsed the instructions he would bark at the staff, his usual air of command and criticism intact. Yet, as he rounded a corner into a quiet hallway, a strange sensation washed over him. His steps faltered, and he placed a hand against the wall for support. "What on earth?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. A tightness gripped his chest, spreading like a vice across his torso. He tried to take a deep breath, but his lungs felt constricted, as though refusing to expand. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead and his vision blurred. The box of decorations slipped from his grasp, crashing to the floor. The delicate crystal pieces scattered across the polished marble, but he barely noticed. The pain in his chest intensified, sharp and unrelenting. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one more labored than the last. Panic set in as his legs buckled beneath him. He stumbled against the wall, sliding down until he was seated on the cold floor. The sensation of helplessness was foreign to him, terrifying. "Help," he tried to call out, but the word came out as little more than a whisper. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, eerily silent. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers numb and clumsy. The device slipped from his grasp, landing just out of reach. Desperation clouded his thoughts. He, Leonard Morgan, the man who prided himself on control and composure, was utterly alone. Meanwhile, upstairs, Chloe wandered through the hotel's grand corridors. Her small hand clutched her beloved teddy bear, Mr. Paws, and her wide eyes took in the sparkling chandeliers and plush carpets with curiosity. Despite her earlier encounter with Mr. Morgan, her natural wonder remained undiminished. As she turned a corner, she noticed an open door leading to a quieter hallway. She hesitated, remembering her parents' reminder to stay where she was allowed, but something about the silence tugged at her, urging her to take a closer look. "What do you think, Mr. Paws?" she whispered, holding the bear close. "Should we take a peek?" With cautious steps, Chloe ventured down the hallway. The faint sounds of the bustling hotel faded into the distance, replaced by a peculiar stillness. She was about to turn back when a glint on the floor caught her eye. Shattered crystals sparkled in the dim light like tiny stars scattered across the polished floor. Her gaze followed the trail of broken decorations until it landed on a figure slumped against the wall. Mr. Morgan lay motionless, his face pale and his eyes closed. Chloe's heart raced, her chest tightening with a mix of fear and concern. "Mr. Morgan?" she called out softly, her voice trembling. There was no response. She took a hesitant step closer, her small frame trembling. For a brief moment, she considered walking away. After all, this was the man who had scolded her, embarrassed her, and made her feel small. But as she looked at his still form, a different feeling stirred within her, a deep need to help no matter what had happened between them. Clutching Mr. Paws tightly, Chloe made up her mind. She took a deep breath, squared her small shoulders, and turned back toward the bustling part of the hotel. Her little legs carried her as fast as they could through the maze of corridors, her teddy bear bouncing against her side. Chloe's small feet padded softly against the thick carpet as she hurried through the grand hotel corridors, her heart pounding like a drum. The image of Mr. Morgan slumped against the wall replayed in her mind, each thought filling her with more urgency. She clutched Mr. Paws tightly, whispering to him as she ran. "We have to help him, Mr. Paws. He's hurt and no one else is around." The hallways were alive with hotel staff, each person bustling about in preparation for the evening gala. Chloe darted among them, her eyes scanning for someone, anyone, who might listen to her. Spotting a waiter balancing a tray of champagne glasses, she tugged gently on his sleeve. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice barely audible above the clinking of glasses. "Mr. Morgan is hurt. He's in a hallway and he needs help." The waiter barely glanced down at her, his focus on keeping the tray steady. "Not now, kiddo," he said dismissively. "I've got to get these out to the ballroom." Chloe's heart sank, but she didn't give up. She spotted a maid pushing a cart laden with fresh linens and hurried over. "Please, ma'am," Chloe pleaded, tugging at the corner of the maid's uniform. "Mr. Morgan is hurt really bad." The maid offered her a distracted smile. "That's sweet, honey, but I'm sure Mr. Morgan is fine. He's a tough guy. Now run along, okay?" Frustration bubbled up inside Chloe as tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "Why won't anyone listen?" she whispered to Mr. Paws, holding him close for comfort. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to give up. Mr. Morgan needed her. The grand lobby was her next stop. It was alive with movement and noise, from the clatter of dishes to the hum of guests arriving for the gala. Chloe stood in the middle of it all, a small figure in the whirlwind of activity. She raised her voice as much as she could manage. "Help! Please, someone help me! Mr. Morgan needs help!" But her voice was drowned out by the chaos around her. No one paid her any attention. A group of staff members walked by, deep in conversation, their laughter ringing out as if nothing was wrong. Chloe's chest tightened, tears of frustration threatening to spill over. She wanted to cry, to sit down and bury her face in Mr. Paws. But then she remembered Mr. Morgan lying helpless in that hallway. Despite how mean he had been, she couldn't just leave him. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, squared her shoulders, and whispered to her teddy bear. "We can't stop Mr. Paws. We have to find someone who will help." Chloe turned toward the elevator. If no one in the lobby would listen, she knew exactly where to go. Her parents would believe her. Her small hand reached for the elevator button, pressing it repeatedly until the doors slid open. She stepped inside, her heart racing, and jabbed at the button for her floor. As the elevator ascended, she whispered to Mr. Paws, her resolve growing stronger. "Mommy and Daddy will know what to do. They always know what to do." When the elevator doors opened, Chloe darted down the hallway toward her family's room, the plush carpet muffling the sound of her hurried footsteps. She reached the door, fumbling with the keycard in her trembling hands. After what felt like an eternity, the lock beeped and the door swung open. "Mommy, Daddy!" Chloe cried out, her voice trembling with urgency. Inside, her parents were finishing their preparations for the next session of their conference. Dr. Sarah Johnson was adjusting her husband's tie, while Dr. James Johnson smoothed the front of his jacket. They both turned toward their daughter, alarmed by the panic in her voice. "Chloe, sweetheart, what's wrong?" Sarah asked, kneeling down to her daughter's level. Chloe took a deep, shaky breath, her words spilling out in a rush. "It's Mr. Morgan, the man from the lobby. He's lying on the floor in a hallway and he's not moving. I tried to tell people, but no one would listen." James immediately straightened, his medical training kicking in. "Where is he, Chloe? Show us." "In a quiet hallway near the big room where they're getting ready for the party," Chloe said, her words coming out in gasps as she tried to catch her breath. Sarah grabbed her medical bag from the closet without hesitation. "Let's go," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Chloe, lead the way." With Chloe at the front, clutching Mr. Paws tightly, The family hurried through the hotel corridors. As they passed staff and guests, Sarah and James exchanged glances, their shared sense of urgency palpable. Chloe, despite her small size, seemed to radiate determination, her pace quick and steady as she guided her parents to the hallway where she had found Mr. Morgan. When they arrived, Mr. Morgan was still slumped against the wall, his face ashen and his breathing shallow. The shattered crystals from the box of decorations glinted on the floor around him like fallen stars. Sarah knelt beside him immediately, her practiced hands checking his pulse and breathing. "It's weak," she said, her voice steady. "He's having a heart attack." James knelt on the other side, placing a hand on Mr. Morgan's shoulder. "Stay with us, Mr. Morgan," he said firmly, though the man's eyes remained closed. He pulled out his phone and quickly dialed 911, relaying their location and the situation to the dispatcher. As James spoke, Sarah began administering chest compressions, her movements quick and precise. "We need the paramedics here now," she said urgently. "His vitals are critical." Chloe stood a few steps back, her wide eyes fixed on her parents as they worked together to help Mr. Morgan. She felt a mix of fear and awe, fear for the man who had seemed so invincible just hours ago, and awe at her parents' calm expertise. Hugging Mr. Paws tightly, she whispered, "They'll help him. They always help people." The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor as hotel staff, alerted by the commotion, began to gather. Gasps of shock rippled through the small crowd as they took in the scene. One bellhop leaned toward another, whispering, "That's Mr. Morgan. What happened?" Through it all, Chloe's parents remained focused, their training and teamwork guiding their every move. The minutes stretched on endlessly, but finally, the distant wail of sirens broke through the tension. Relief washed over Chloe as the paramedics arrived, their equipment in tow. The paramedics rushed into the hallway, their arrival heralded by the squeak of stretcher wheels and the clinking of medical equipment. They moved with practiced urgency, taking over from Sarah and James. One paramedic, a woman with a calm but commanding presence, knelt beside Mr. Morgan and assessed the situation. "He's in cardiac arrest," she said, quickly opening her kit. "We'll need to administer CPR and oxygen immediately." James stepped back, his hand resting protectively on Chloe's shoulder. "We've stabilized him as much as we could," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "His pulse was faint when we found him." The paramedic nodded, already placing an oxygen mask over Mr. Morgan's face while her partner prepped a defibrillator. "You did great work. You likely bought him the time he needed." Chloe watched with wide, unblinking eyes as the paramedics worked swiftly, attaching monitors and preparing to administer a shock to restart Mr. Morgan's heart. She clung tightly to Mr. Paws, whispering to him as if her teddy bear could somehow share in her worry. "They're helping him now, Mr. Paws. He'll be okay, right?" Sarah knelt down to Chloe's level, gently placing a hand on her daughter's cheek. "Sweetie, you were so brave to come find us," she said softly. "You gave him the best chance to get help. I'm so proud of you." Chloe's eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded, her trust in her parents' words giving her comfort. She turned her attention back to Mr. Morgan, watching as the paramedics delivered the first shock. His body jolted slightly, the monitor emitting a sharp beep before returning to an irregular rhythm. "We've got a pulse," the paramedic announced, her voice filled with relief but still focused. "Let's get him loaded onto the stretcher." As they prepared to move Mr. Morgan, one of the paramedics turned to Sarah and James. "Are you family?" she asked. "No," James replied, shaking his head. "But we're doctors, and we're staying here at the hotel. Our daughter found him and brought us to help." The paramedic looked at Chloe, her expression softening. "That was very brave of you, young lady," she said with a warm smile. "You probably saved his life." Chloe's cheeks flushed pink and she hugged Mr. Paws closer. "I just wanted to help," she said quietly. The paramedics carefully lifted Mr. Morgan onto the stretcher and wheeled him toward the elevator, their movements precise and deliberate. Chloe watched them go, her small figure still as she held onto her parents' hands. As the elevator doors closed, carrying Mr. Morgan down to the awaiting ambulance, Chloe whispered softly, "Please take good care of him." The aftermath of the incident rippled through the hotel like a wave. Whispers of what had happened spread quickly among the staff, each retelling adding to the sense of disbelief. Mr. Morgan, the strict, no-nonsense manager who ruled the hotel with an iron fist, had suffered a heart attack, and the little girl he had berated in the lobby had been the one to save him. "I can't believe it," said Marie, a receptionist, as she spoke with a group of colleagues in the break room. Chloe was so polite even after he yelled at her, and now she's the reason he's still alive. Tom, a bellhop, nodded solemnly. "It makes you think, doesn't it? We were all so scared of him, so afraid of speaking up when he was out of line. But that little girl, she just wanted to help." The staff's guilt weighed heavily on them as they reflected on their own inaction. They remembered the way Mr. Morgan had scolded Chloe in the lobby, how they had stood by uncomfortable but silent. Now, knowing what had transpired, they felt ashamed of their inability to step in. "She showed us all up," said Anna, a waitress. "That little girl reminded us what courage really looks like." Later that evening, Chloe sat in her hotel room with her parents, curled up on the bed with Mr. Paws. She felt a little quieter than usual, the events of the day weighing on her mind. Sarah sat beside her, brushing a hand gently through Chloe's curls. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Sarah asked softly. Chloe looked up at her mother, her big brown eyes filled with questions. "Do you think Mr. Morgan will be okay?" she asked. "He looks so sick." James joined them, sitting on the edge of the bed. "He's in good hands now," he assured her. "The paramedics and the doctors at the hospital will take care of him. And thanks to you, they got to him in time." Chloe nodded, but a small frown lingered on her face. "Why was he so mean to me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah and James exchanged a glance, their hearts aching for their daughter's innocent confusion. "Sometimes, people carry things inside them that make them act in ways that aren't fair," Sarah explained gently. "Mr. Morgan may have been dealing with stress or sadness, but that doesn't make what he said okay." "But you showed him something different," James added, his voice filled with pride. "You showed him kindness and forgiveness even when he didn't deserve it. That's a very special thing, Chloe." Chloe tilted her head, processing her parents' words. After a moment, she hugged Mr. Paws tightly and said, "I just hope he gets better." Across town, in a sterile hospital room, Mr. Morgan stirred awake. The dim hum of monitors and the sharp scent of antiseptic greeted him as his eyes fluttered open. His chest felt heavy and his limbs were weak, but he was alive. A nurse stood by his bedside, checking his vitals. When she noticed his movement, she smiled. "Good evening, Mr. Morgan. Welcome back." "What happened?" he croaked, his throat dry. "You had a heart attack," the nurse explained gently. "You're lucky to be alive. A little girl found you and got help. Her parents, doctors staying at your hotel, helped stabilize you until the paramedics arrived." Mr. Morgan's brow furrowed in confusion. "A little girl?" The nurse nodded. "Her name is Chloe. From what I heard, she ran all over the hotel trying to get someone to help you. Without her, things might have turned out very differently." The words hit Mr. Morgan like a tidal wave. His mind raced, piecing together fragmented memories of the day, the irritation, the scolding, the way he had dismissed Chloe without a second thought. Shame bubbled up inside him, mingling with a profound sense of gratitude. "The girl I yelled at saved my life," he whispered, his voice cracking. The nurse, unaware of the earlier incident, smiled kindly. "It seems she did." As the nurse left to give him some rest, Mr. Morgan lay back against the pillow, tears stinging his eyes. The weight of his actions pressed down on him. He had nearly lost his life, and it was saved by the very person he had wronged. A mixture of shame and determination filled him. He couldn't change the past, but he could choose how to move forward. The hours after Mr. Morgan's realization passed slowly. Lying in the hospital bed, He replayed the events of the last few days over and over in his mind. His scolding of Chloe, her quiet resilience, and now, her bravery. It was all a stark reminder of how blind he had been to his own behavior. By morning, Mr. Morgan knew he couldn't wait another moment to express his gratitude and remorse. When the nurse returned to check on him, he cleared his throat. "Do you know if the little girl and her family are still at the hotel?" he asked, his voice raspy but steady. "I believe so," the nurse replied, adjusting his IV. "Would you like us to send a message to them?" "Yes," Mr. Morgan said quickly, his fingers gripping the blanket. "Please, I need to speak with them. It's important." The nurse gave him an understanding nod. "I'll make sure the hotel knows." At the Lexington Hotel, the Johnson family was sitting down for breakfast in the dining area. Chloe sipped her orange juice, her mood lighter after a good night's sleep. Her parents were relieved to see her smiling again, though they noticed she occasionally glanced toward the entrance, as if expecting someone. As they enjoyed their meal, a staff member approached their table, a polite smile on her face. "Good morning, Dr. and Dr. Johnson," she said, addressing Sarah and James. "I have a message from Mr. Morgan. He'd like to meet with your family when you're available." James and Sarah exchanged a look, and Sarah turned to Chloe. "Sweetheart, how do you feel about meeting Mr. Morgan again?" Chloe's eyes widened slightly, and she hugged Mr. Paws to her chest. I think he wants to say sorry." "I think so too," Sarah said with a smile. "But if you don't feel comfortable, we don't have to go." Chloe thought for a moment, then nodded firmly. "I want to go." The staff member relayed the message, and within the hour, the Johnson family arrived at the hospital. They were escorted to Mr. Morgan's room, Chloe clutching Mr. Paws tightly as they walked. When they entered, they found Mr. Morgan sitting up in bed, looking pale and tired, but alert. As they stepped inside, Mr. Morgan's gaze fell on Chloe. His throat tightened, but he managed a small, tentative smile. "Chloe," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for coming." Chloe stood between her parents, looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and kindness. "Are you feeling better?" she asked quietly. Mr. Morgan nodded, his eyes glistening. "Thanks to you. You saved my life, Chloe. I don't know how to begin to thank you." Chloe tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "You don't have to thank me," she said simply. "You needed help, so I helped you." Her words struck Mr. Morgan like a hammer, breaking through the last of his defenses. Tears welled in his eyes, and he quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand. "You're an incredible little girl," he said, "and I was terribly wrong to treat you the way I did. I can't tell you how sorry I am for how I behaved." Sarah and James watched the exchange silently, pride swelling in their hearts as they saw Chloe's compassion shine through. Chloe, for her part, hesitated for only a moment before giving Mr. Morgan a small smile. "It's okay," she said. "You can be nicer now." Her simple statement carried a profound weight, and Mr. Morgan nodded, his resolve strengthening. "I will," he said. "I promise you, Chloe. I'll be better." In the days following his discharge from the hospital, Mr. Morgan wasted no time putting his promise into action. His first step was to address his staff. The employees gathered in the grand ballroom, expecting yet another lecture on precision and perfection. Instead, they were met with a man who looked humbled and earnest. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Morgan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I wanted to speak to you today, not as your manager, but as someone who has learned an important lesson. Recently, I almost lost my life, and in that moment, it wasn't my accomplishments or my reputation that mattered. It was the kindness of a little girl who saved me." The room was silent, every eye on Mr. Morgan as he continued. "I realize now that I've let my desire for perfection blind me to the people who make this hotel what it is. I've been unfair, unkind, and often unapproachable. For that, I owe each of you an apology." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the Mr. Morgan they knew. The stern, uncompromising man who rarely acknowledged their efforts. "I can't change the past," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "But I can change how I move forward. From this moment on, I want to build a better environment for all of us, one based on respect and understanding." The staff exchanged glances, some still skeptical, but others visibly moved. A young bellhop raised his hand hesitantly. "Does this mean you're not going to yell at us anymore?" Mr. Morgan chuckled softly, a sound unfamiliar to most of them. "It means I'll do my best to treat you the way you deserve to be treated," he said. "And if I fall short, I hope you'll remind me of the person I'm trying to become." Word of Mr. Morgan's transformation spread quickly, not just among the staff but to the guests who frequented the hotel. The once intimidating manager became a symbol of change, his newfound kindness and humility inspiring those around him. He also began volunteering at a local community center, dedicating time to helping children and families in need. As for Chloe, her story became something of a legend at the Lexington Hotel. Staff and guests alike spoke of the little girl who had saved a life and, in doing so, sparked a ripple of kindness that touched everyone she encountered. One day, a package arrived at the Johnson family's home. Inside was a handwritten letter from Mr. Morgan, along with a beautifully crafted crystal teddy bear figurine. The letter read, "Dear Chloe, thank you for saving my life in more ways than one. Your bravery and kindness taught me lessons I'll carry with me forever. This crystal teddy bear reminded me of you and Mr. Paws, strong, unbreakable, and full of light. Please accept it as a small token of my gratitude. With all my respect and thanks." Leonard Morgan. Chloe placed the figurine on her nightstand beside Mr. Paws, her small hand resting on the sparkling bear. She didn't fully understand the impact she'd had, but she knew one thing. Helping others felt right, no matter what. The Johnsons often reflected on their experience at the Lexington Hotel, grateful for the way it had brought out the best in all of them. Chloe's courage and compassion had not only saved a life, but had transformed a heart. And in the process, it reminded everyone that even the smallest acts of kindness can leave the biggest impact. Dr. Sarah Johnson knelt beside Chloe, her hands gently smoothing the edges of her daughter's curly hair. Chloe clung tightly to her teddy bear, Mr. Paws, her large, expressive brown eyes searching her mother's face for answers. The events of the past day had left her confused, and her young mind was full of questions. "But why was Mr. Morgan so mean to me before?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Did I do something wrong?" Sarah glanced at her husband, Dr. James Johnson, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. They both knew this was a pivotal teaching moment, a chance to help Chloe understand a complex world without dampening her kindness and compassion. "No, honey," Sarah said gently, cupping Chloe's cheek. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people act unkindly because they're scared or because they don't understand something that's different from what they know. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It means there's something they need to learn." Chloe tilted her head, her expression puzzled. "Scared? Was Mr. Morgan scared of me?" "Not exactly scared," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. "But sometimes, when people don't take the time to understand someone, they make assumptions. Those assumptions can make them act in ways that are unfair or even mean." James, sitting beside them, leaned forward to join the conversation. "It's like when you're afraid of the dark, sweetheart. The dark itself isn't bad, but it feels scary because you can't see what's there. Some people feel that way about others who look or act differently from them. Instead of trying to understand, they let that fear or confusion turn into anger or judgment." Chloe furrowed her brow, her fingers lightly tracing the soft fur of Mr. Paws. "So, Mr. Morgan didn't know me, so he thought I was bad?" James shook his head gently. "Not bad, Chloe, but he made a mistake in judging you before he got to know you. And that wasn't fair to you," Sarah chimed in, her voice soft but firm. "What's important is how we respond when people make those mistakes. You chose to help Mr. Morgan, even though he had been unkind to you. That's what makes you special, Chloe. James smiled warmly at his daughter. By showing kindness, you helped Mr. Morgan see past his fear. You showed him what really matters, what's in a person's heart. Chloe nodded slowly, processing her parents' words. She looked over at Mr. Morgan, who sat nearby in his hospital bed. His face, pale and lined with exhaustion, was soft with emotion. His eyes, brimming with unshed tears, were fixed on Chloe as if her forgiveness had given him a second chance. Not just at life, but at being a better person. I think I understand now, Chloe said softly. Everyone deserves kindness, even when they make mistakes. Her parents beamed with pride, their hearts swelling at the wisdom and compassion radiating from their daughter. Sarah leaned forward to hug Chloe tightly, her voice thick with emotion. Exactly, sweetheart. And that's what makes you so special. Nearby, Mr. Morgan wiped at his eyes, overwhelmed by the simplicity and power of Chloe's words. He had spent his life enforcing rules, maintaining appearances, and striving for perfection. Yet in one moment, this little girl had taught him more about humanity than years of experience ever could. News of Chloe's heroic actions and Mr. Morgan's apology began to ripple through the Lexington Hotel. Staff and guests alike couldn't stop talking about the little girl who had saved the life of the man who had treated her so harshly. The story carried with it an emotional weight that touched everyone who heard it. In the staff break room, Sarah, a receptionist who had been working the front desk during the incident in the lobby, approached her supervisor with tears glistening in her eyes. "I saw the way Mr. Morgan spoke to that little girl yesterday," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I felt awful, but I was too afraid to say anything. Now I realize I should have stood up for her." Her supervisor, Denise, placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. "We've all been there," she said gently. "Sometimes it's hard to find the courage to speak up, especially when you're afraid of the consequences. What matters is that we learn from this moment and do better next time." In the hotel restaurant, a group of guests gathered for breakfast discussed the story in hushed tones. An elderly woman, her hands clasped around a steaming cup of tea, shook her head as she recalled the events of the previous day. "That poor child," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I can't believe we all just stood there and watched it happen. We should have said something." A businessman seated nearby overheard and leaned toward their table. "I was there too," he confessed. "I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't want to make a scene. Now I see that sometimes making a scene is exactly what's needed." As the day progressed, more and more people came forward, sharing their feelings of guilt and vowing to change. The atmosphere in the hotel began to shift in a tangible way. Staff members who had once feared Mr. Morgan's stern demeanor now felt inspired to embrace a culture of kindness and courage. During the afternoon staff meeting, Denise addressed the group, her tone resolute but compassionate. "Yesterday was a wake-up call for all of us," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "We need to create an environment where everyone feels respected and valued, regardless of who they are or where they come from. From now on, let's commit to speaking up when we see something wrong, no matter how small it might seem." The staff nodded in agreement, many of them reflecting on Chloe's bravery and kindness. Her actions had shown them that the smallest voices could sometimes teach the most powerful lessons. The realization left an indelible mark on the hotel's culture. Meanwhile, in his office, Mr. Morgan sat at his desk, still pale and shaken from his recent ordeal. His trembling hands rested on the polished wood as he stared at the phone. It had taken him hours to muster the courage to pick it up, and now, with a deep breath, he finally dialed the extension for Lisa, the event coordinator. "Hello, Lisa," Mr. Morgan said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "It's Leonard Morgan. I need to make some changes to tonight's gala program." Lisa hesitated, surprised by the unfamiliar tone in her boss's voice. "Of course, Mr. Morgan. What would you like to adjust?" Mr. Morgan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as he collected his thoughts. "We need to include a special presentation," he said. "I want to honor Chloe. She deserves to be recognized for what she did. Lisa's surprise quickly gave way to understanding. That's a wonderful idea, she said warmly. Do you have something in mind? Yes, he replied, his voice gaining strength. Prepare an award, something fitting for a young hero, and I'll be giving a speech myself. As Lisa made notes, Mr. Morgan's mind raced. He couldn't shake the image of Chloe's face, the innocent yet wise expression of a child who had shown him more grace than he had ever given her. His heart ached with the weight of his past actions, but alongside the shame was a fierce determination to change. We'll make it happen, Lisa said after jotting down the details. It's a beautiful gesture, Mr. Morgan. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. When the call ended, he set the phone down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. His hands covered his face as tears welled in his eyes. He had always prided himself on control and composure, yet now he felt like a different man. A better man, perhaps, but one still grappling with the enormity of his mistakes. The rest of the afternoon was spent crafting his speech. Each word was chosen with care as he poured his heart into what he wanted to say. He knew this was more than an apology. It was a chance to set a new example for his staff and guests. By the time evening arrived, Mr. Morgan had rewritten and rehearsed the speech countless times, yet he still felt nervous. The grand ballroom of the Lexington Hotel was a vision of elegance. Twinkling lights draped the high ceilings. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow, and the tables were adorned with lavish floral arrangements and fine linens. Guests in their finest attire mingled, their laughter and conversation creating a soft hum of excitement. Near the entrance, Chloe stood with her parents, her small hand clasped tightly in her mother's. She wore a delicate blue dress her parents had bought especially for the occasion, and Mr. Paws was tucked securely under her arm. Her wide eyes darted around the room, taking in the glittering decorations and the crowd of important-looking people. It's like a dream, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the buzz of the room. James knelt beside her, smoothing a wrinkle in her dress. It sure is, sweetheart, he said with a warm smile. But remember, tonight you're the real star. Chloe looked up at her father, her brow furrowing with nervousness. I don't feel like a star, Daddy. I feel scared. Sarah crouched beside her, brushing a stray curl from Chloe's face. It's okay to feel nervous, sweetie, she said gently. But remember, you did something very brave. Everyone here is excited to celebrate you because of it, James added. And we'll be right here with you the whole time. You're not alone. Taking a deep breath, Chloe nodded. Her fingers tightened around Mr. Paws, drawing comfort from its familiar softness. As they stepped further into the room, several guests turned to look at them, their faces lighting up with warm smiles. Chloe felt her cheeks grow warm, but she managed a shy smile in return. Across the room, Mr. Morgan spotted the family entering the ballroom. He took a deep breath, straightening his tie and running a hand through his hair before making his way toward them. His steps felt heavier than usual, weighted by the speech he had prepared and the emotions swirling in his chest. Good evening, he said softly when he reached them. His voice lacked its usual sternness, replaced instead by a gentleness that surprised even him. He knelt slightly to meet Chloe's gaze. Chloe, I have a surprise for you tonight. You're going to be our guest of honor. Chloe's eyes widened, her mouth opening slightly in surprise. Me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, you, Mr. Morgan replied, his throat tightening with emotion. You deserve it, Chloe. You've taught me, and everyone else here, what it means to be truly kind and brave. I want everyone to know how special you are. Chloe glanced at her parents, who nodded encouragingly. A shy smile spread across her face as she looked back at Mr. Morgan. Thank you, she said softly. As the gala began, soft classical music filled the air, mingling with the clinking of champagne glasses and the hum of conversation. The room seemed to sparkle with an energy that felt different from other events, warmer, more intimate. Guests found their seats as waiters moved gracefully through the crowd, serving delicate hors d'oeuvres and drinks. Chloe and her parents were seated near the front, their table adorned with the finest decorations. Despite her initial nervousness, Chloe began to relax, her excitement growing as she watched the elegant scene unfold. As the soft murmur of conversation faded, the lights dimmed slightly, and all attention turned to the stage. Mr. Morgan stepped up to the microphone, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wooden floor. He paused, adjusting his tie with trembling fingers. For a man known for his composed and commanding presence, he now seemed deeply vulnerable. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying a mixture of nervousness and sincerity. "Tonight, I stand before you not just as the manager of this hotel, but as a man who has been given a second chance at life." The crowd, curious and attentive, leaned in as he continued. Chloe clutched Mr. Paws tightly, her wide eyes fixed on Mr. Morgan. Her parents exchanged a glance, their hands resting on hers for reassurance. "Yesterday," Mr. Morgan said, his voice faltering slightly, "I suffered a severe heart attack. It happened in an empty hallway of this hotel, a place I have called my second home for so many years. I was alone, scared, and certain that my time had come." A hushed silence fell over the room. The normally composed Mr. Morgan seemed almost fragile as he recounted his experience. "But fate," he continued, his voice breaking with emotion, "had other plans for me, and that's thanks to a young girl with a heart of gold." He paused, scanning the room until his gaze fell on Chloe. His lips trembled into a sad but grateful smile. "This little girl, whom I had shamefully mistreated earlier that day, found me collapsed on the floor, and instead of walking away, she ran to get help, ultimately saving my life." Gasps rippled through the audience as they processed his words. All eyes turned toward Chloe, who sat frozen in her chair, her cheeks flushing under the sudden attention. Mr. Morgan raised a hand to quiet the murmurs. "I must confess something to all of you," he said, his voice growing steadier. "When I first saw Chloe in the lobby, I let my prejudices and assumptions cloud my judgment. I saw her innocence and kindness, yet I treated her with disdain. I made her feel unwelcome in a place that should have been a haven for everyone." Tears glistened in his eyes as he continued. "And yet, when the moment came, she showed me more kindness and bravery than I have ever shown in my entire career." The room was silent, save for the occasional sniffle. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, captivated by Mr. Morgan's raw honesty. "This experience has taught me something profound about the dangers of prejudice and the power of forgiveness," he said. "I nearly lost my life because of my narrow-mindedness, but I was saved by the very person I had wronged." He took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving Chloe. "Chloe, would you join me on stage?" he asked, his voice filled with emotion. The crowd turned toward her, their eyes full of encouragement. Chloe hesitated, looking up at her parents for guidance. Sarah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. You can do this." With a deep breath, Chloe stood up. Her small fingers gripped Mr. Paws tightly as she walked toward the stage, her steps hesitant but steady. The room was so quiet that the soft rustle of her dress could be heard. When she reached the stage, Mr. Morgan did something that left the audience stunned. He slowly lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself to her eye level. The once imposing manager now looked up at the young girl who had saved him, his humility radiating across the room. "Chloe," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you the biggest apology. What I did to you was wrong, and I am truly sorry. You showed me what true kindness looks like, and I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to be the person you already believed I could be." Chloe looked at him with her big, thoughtful eyes. The audience held their breath as they waited for her response. "I forgive you, Mr. Morgan," she said softly, her voice carrying through the silent room. Her words, simple yet profound, brought tears to the eyes of many in the crowd. The ballroom erupted in applause. Guests stood to their feet, clapping and cheering for Chloe. She blinked, startled by the overwhelming sound, but her parents' proud smiles reassured her. She gave Mr. Morgan a shy smile and hugged her teddy bear tightly. Mr. Morgan rose to his feet, placing a gentle hand on Chloe's shoulder. He turned to the audience, his voice filled with admiration. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what a true hero looks like." The applause grew louder, and the crowd's energy felt electric. Several guests wiped away tears, moved by the moment. Chloe's parents watched from their table, their hearts swelling with pride. As the applause settled, an elderly woman approached the stage. Her hands trembled slightly as she addressed Chloe. "Young lady," she said, her voice quavering with emotion, "you've taught us all a valuable lesson tonight." Chloe tilted her head, curiosity shining in her eyes. "What lesson?" she asked innocently. The woman smiled warmly. "The power of forgiveness, dear, and the importance of looking beyond what we see on the surface." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. A businessman in an expensive suit stood up, his voice carrying across the room. "I'm ashamed to admit that I saw how Mr. Morgan treated you, Chloe," he said, "and I did nothing. Your kindness has shown me that we all need to be braver in standing up for what's right." Others began sharing similar sentiments, each story adding to the atmosphere of warmth and admiration that filled the ballroom. Chloe listened quietly, her young mind absorbing the impact of her actions. Mr. Morgan cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention back to him. "Chloe has shown us that sometimes the youngest among us can be our greatest teachers," he said. "Her forgiveness has changed me, and I hope it changes all of us." The room fell silent, each guest reflecting on his words. Slowly, people began approaching one another, offering apologies for past slights and extending hands in newfound friendship. The gala, originally intended as a celebration of luxury, had transformed into something much more meaningful. The following morning was quiet and serene, the early sunlight filtering through the grand windows of the Lexington Hotel lobby. Chloe and her parents were nearly packed and ready to check out, their luggage neatly arranged by the door of their suite. Chloe sat on the edge of her bed, holding Mr. Paws tightly as she thought about everything that had happened over the past few days. Her parents were busy double-checking their belongings, but Sarah noticed Chloe's quiet demeanor. She sat beside her daughter, wrapping an arm around her small shoulders. "What's on your mind, sweetie?" she asked gently. Chloe looked up at her mother, her eyes filled with questions. "Do you think Mr. Morgan will really change?" Sarah smiled, brushing a curl from Chloe's face. "I think he already has, sweetheart. Sometimes it just takes someone special to show people the way." Chloe nodded thoughtfully. "I hope so. I don't want him to feel bad forever." James, overhearing from the other side of the room, walked over and knelt in front of his daughter. "I don't think he'll feel bad forever," he said with a kind smile. "What he feels now will help him become a better person. You've already made a difference, Chloe. That's something to be proud of." Chloe smiled, hugging Mr. Paws close. "Okay, Daddy." When the family entered the lobby, they were surprised to find Mr. Morgan waiting for them near the front desk. He stood tall, but his face had softened significantly since their first meeting. He held a small gift box in his hands, wrapped neatly with a gold ribbon. As the Johnsons approached, Mr. Morgan stepped forward, bowing his head slightly in greeting. "Good morning," he said, his tone warm and sincere. "I wanted to be here to thank you again before you left." Chloe tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the gift box. Mr. Morgan knelt down to her level, holding the box out to her. "This is for you, Chloe," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a small token of my gratitude. You've taught me lessons I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Chloe hesitated for a moment, then took the box with careful hands. She looked up at her parents, who nodded encouragingly, and then untied the ribbon. Inside was a crystal figurine of a teddy bear, its edges sparkling like tiny rainbows in the morning light. "It reminded me of you and Mr. Paws," Mr. Morgan said softly. "Strong, brave, and full of light." Chloe's face lit up with a radiant smile. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan," she said, holding the figurine close. "You're very welcome," he replied, his eyes glistening. "And thank you, Chloe, for everything." Turning to Sarah and James, Mr. Morgan extended his hand. "You've raised an incredible daughter," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Thank you for letting her teach me what it means to be better." Sarah and James shook his hand warmly, their pride evident. "It's never too late to grow," James said. "We're glad she could help." As the family stepped outside to their waiting taxi, Mr. Morgan insisted on carrying their bags. The hotel staff watched from a respectful distance, marveling at the transformation in their manager. He placed the luggage carefully in the trunk before stepping back to bid them farewell. Chloe turned to him one last time, waving cheerfully. "Bye, Mr. Morgan. I hope you have a nice day." Mr. Morgan waved back, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Goodbye, Chloe. Have a safe trip." He stood there as the taxi pulled away, watching until it disappeared around the corner. For a long moment, he remained still, reflecting on the profound impact Chloe had left on his life. Back inside, the atmosphere of the hotel was noticeably different. The staff, inspired by Chloe's actions and Mr. Morgan's transformation, carried themselves with renewed purpose. Mr. Morgan himself greeted employees and guests alike with warmth, taking time to listen and ensure everyone felt valued. Guests began to comment on the noticeable shift in the hotel's culture. "This place feels different," one regular remarked to a bellhop. "It's more welcoming than ever before." Word of Chloe's story spread far beyond the walls of the hotel. The annual Chloe's Kindness Award became a cherished tradition, celebrated with heartfelt speeches and moments of reflection on the values of compassion and inclusivity. Each year, a new recipient was chosen, an employee who embodied the spirit of kindness and the courage to make a difference. And each year, Chloe and her family were invited back to present the award in person. Years later, Chloe, now a young woman, stood on the familiar stage of the Grand Ballroom, presenting the Chloe's Kindness Award to its latest recipient. The room was filled with applause, but her thoughts drifted back to that life-changing week when she was just a little girl clutching her teddy bear. As she stepped down from the stage, she caught sight of Mr. Morgan in the audience. His hair was grayer now, and his face bore the lines of age, but his smile was as warm as ever. They exchanged a knowing look, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had both taken. Later that evening, as Chloe and Mr. Morgan shared a quiet conversation, he said, "You know, Chloe, this hotel is what it is today because of you. You reminded me, and all of us, that kindness is the most powerful change of all." Chloe smiled, her heart full. "I just did what felt right," she said. "And that," Mr. Morgan replied, "is what made all the difference." The Lexington Hotel continued to thrive, not just as a symbol of luxury, but as a beacon of warmth and humanity. And Chloe's story remained a testament to the power of one small act to change the world.